The scripture today is taken from the book of 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 1 to 16. Follow as I read. Do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn first of all to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Give the people these instructions too, so that no one may be open to blame. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60, has been faithful to her husband, and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the saints, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list. For when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus, they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things they ought not to. So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. Some have in fact already turned away to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has widows in her family, she should help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need. This is the word of the Lord.
Amen. So we're continuing our series through the book of 1 Timothy, where we're examining how Paul discipled Timothy in the pastorship of the Ephesian church in order to learn how to be disciples who totally give it up for Jesus Christ. And as often, every Sunday, we start with this verse because here Jesus defines what it means to follow him very clearly. He says this in Luke 9:23-24. Then he said to them all, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it. And I hope it's been clear by now that to follow Jesus means to lose everything for him, to devote your whole life to him, nothing held back. You give everything to Jesus. That's what it means to be a disciple. But I also want to let you guys know that as well as losing it all for Jesus, there's also that part where Jesus says, take up your cross daily. Take up your cross. Now, we have to remember that the call of discipleship is not just out of a vacuum, out of nowhere, but it's actually a response to what Jesus said before in Luke 9:22 and 21, where he was predicting his own death. See, God will never ask you anything that he hasn't done himself. See, Jesus said, I'm going to take up a cross. I'm going to deny myself, and I'm going to go and die for your sins. That's what he was doing. And then he says, if you want to follow me, if you want to be a disciple, you got to do what I have to do. So one, losing it all, but another is to take up your cross. Now, what does it mean to take up your cross? We know from Philippians 2 and other parts of the Bible that for Jesus to take up his cross was the expression of ultimate sacrificial servanthood. So if you want to know what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, it means losing it all for Jesus, but it also means to follow him in the path of sacrificial servanthood. If you want to know what the greatest sign of a disciple of Jesus is, it's the fact that we serve. The greatest expression of discipleship is the fact that we serve sacrificially. So this Sunday, this morning, what we're going to learn from the Bible is what does it mean to serve? the way Jesus served, to serve sacrificially. And Paul, in the passage that we just read, identifies a group that needed a lot of serving, and that were widows back in his day. Now, in his passage, in his instruction to Timothy about widows, we learn a lot. We receive a lot of great principles on how and whom to serve sacrificially as followers of Jesus. So the message is pretty simple. One, we're going to learn that from this passage that we serve as family. Number two, we serve the least, and we serve wisely. So the question of the day is, how and whom do we serve? Well, we find out in the passage that we serve as family, we serve the least, and serve wisely. So a lot of this is continuation from last week. I told you that we were going to spend a couple Sundays on verses 1 to 16. You cannot read the instructions about widows and about serving widows without reading verses 1 to 2, in which Paul tells Timothy to look at the church as family. Behold, they are not a project. They are not just servants. They are just not lay people. They're just not parishioners. When you see your church, when you gather together, what you're seeing are your fathers, brothers, mothers, and sisters. And that's the view we ought to take with each other. We're not just friends. We're not just people who agree on the same things. We're just not members of the same party or what have you. When you look at each other right now, you see your fathers, mothers, brothers, and sisters, and sons and daughters. That's how close you are when you call and when you follow the name of Jesus. You are not strangers anymore. You're just not friends. You're family. And so as a family, we have to understand that we, as the family of God, are in the family business. Now, remember last week I said that when one has the presence of God, not only do you recognize that everyone is family and that you belong to Jesus now and that your sins are forgiven, but when you have the presence of God, one of the great outpourings of God's presence in your life is that you understand what mission is and that you start to do what God does. Because you cannot be with God and not be changed by Him. You cannot be with God and not want to do what He does. And it's very important to know that when God talks about what we're supposed to do, He talks about it in the context of being family. Because in the first century, a family never did, well, let me say it more positively. A family did what their father did. There was very little social mobility back then. And they did not have the big career choices that we have now. Nobody went to college and nobody got to choose, well, I'm going to major in this and I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. No, back then, if you were born in a tanner's family, guess what business you were going to do for the rest of your life? You were going to do tanning, and not, like tanning people. I'm talking about, preparing animals for leather and stuff like that. If you were born in a restaurant family, guess what you were going to do? You were going to do restaurant. You were going to do the restaurant business. If your father was a politician, if he was a lord of the manor, if he was a senator in Rome, guess what you were going to be when you grew up? A senator in Rome. So when God says, when you're part of my family, we have to understand in the first century context, that means we're called to do what He does. And so what is the Father's business? The best way to find out what the Father's business is by looking at our elder brother, Jesus. And when Jesus started off His ministry, when He went about the Father's business, as He was saying throughout His childhood, I'm going to be about my Father's business, I'm in my Father's house, I'm going to be about my Father's business. When He started His ministry, this is how He defined what He was going to do. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This is the Father's business, and this is to be our business too. Now, some people say, wait, isn't the business of the church, isn't it supposed to make disciples? Yeah, we're supposed to make disciples, but you have to understand that disciple making is the means to an end. And what is the end? What is the ultimate goal of God? To change this world for His glory. to bring about justice, righteousness in this place. He just doesn't want you to just become disciples and just sit there. What he wants you to do is to make you into disciples, that you begin to care for what he cares for, and that you begin to do what he does. And that is the radical transformation of this world, to proclaim to the world that there is a new world coming. A world where there would be peace, justice, every tear will be wiped away. I mean, read the end of the Bible. It's okay to go for spoilers in the Bible. You can look at the end. It describes a new world where there's no more sorrow, there is no more injustice, there's no more cheating, there's no more pain, there's no more death. Every tear, as I said, will be wiped away, and God will be here. You know, you've heard me say this before, but in the beginning, God created a world and filled it with people. What he's doing now is he's creating a new people to fill a new world that is to come. And that's the whole reason behind mission. That's the whole reason why we want to make disciples, is to announce and to make into reality this coming new world that will culminate when Jesus returns himself. That's what the Christian church is about. This is what the family is about. Wherever we go, we bring the presence of the new world because we bring the presence of God. You see, Christianity is not a personal faith. It's not a private thing we do. It's not just about making your personal life right. It includes that. But Christianity, the gospel, is about making a world right. A world right. Not just life right, but a world right. I mean, just look at what Jesus says. You know, he could have said a lot of things. The Spirit of the Lord is on me to change Esther Singh's life and make her happy and comfortable. Or to change Henry and make him thumbs up. I don't know. No, he doesn't say that at all. He says to proclaim good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, the year of Jubilee, when debts are swiped away and everybody goes back to their inheritance, receives their inheritance, and there is much festival and party. And, you know, we've talked about this before, that if you are rejecting the gospel and Jesus because you don't think it's fun and it's boring, then you don't know what's up. Because Jesus, you know, I spoke about this in a prior message. Jesus is the ultimate party host. That's why his first miracle was turning water to wine. It was not just a metaphor that he's going to change your life into a new life. No, he was also saying, hey, if you stick with me, yes, there will be pain, there will be loss, there will be suffering, but ultimately, I'm preparing you guys for a big party, because look what I'm doing. I'm turning water, icky water, into wine, brother. Ooh, we're going to have a good time. That's what Jesus was saying when he turned the water into wine. The gospel is all about freedom, not just for ourselves, but for the whole world that is under the oppression of sin and Satan and darkness. And you have to understand, this is total kingdom language. The sign that the presence of God is in you is not that you recognize that you're forgiven and that you're new and that you have a family, but as part of this family of God, you have a mission. This is why we share the gospel. The gospel is both justification and justice. It's about being born again, but it's about the born again of this world that we live in. It's about real shalom, peace, justice, all things made right. And if you've been going through the songs of ascent with us, that's been the common theme of the Psalms that we've been reading for Lent. It's about the righteous people of God crying out to their Father, to their Lord, to make things right. We have enemies around us. They are oppressing us. God, when are you going to come and make things right and rescue us? This has been a common theme throughout the Bible. The return to paradise when all things are made right. And as you can see, it was a common theme with Jesus. Constantly, over and over in Jesus' teaching, he always talks about the least of these. In fact, in Matthew 25, he says this, Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world." This is Jesus telling a parable about what it's going to be like when Jesus invites everybody to his throne and he judges the nations. He's going to separate some people to go with him into paradise, and others will be rejected and sent to hell. And to the righteous, he says this: "Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world." And then he goes on, "For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." You did for me. You see, God is greatly concerned for the least. He's greatly concerned for the poor. He's greatly concerned for the marginalized, the people that live on the edge and rim of society. He's so concerned that he identifies with them. That when we say the least, he says, "Include me in. These are my people. These are the people I identify with." So when you do good, when you take care of them, when you serve them, you're serving me. I don't know how much more powerful and how much more convicting that can become. That every time you see a poor person, especially in the church, whenever you see a weak person in the church or even outside, when you serve them, you're serving Jesus. And that really gives us what it means to serve, to sacrificially serve as a disciple of Christ. We are to serve as family, and also we are to serve the least. We serve the least. And back in the first century, there were few that were more least than the widow. Let me tell you about the widow back in the first century. The widow, being a widow for a first century woman, for first century people, equaled tragedy and death. Of course, it's always tragic when you lose a spouse. I mean, we still feel that today. It's a tragedy to lose anybody in your family, right? But more so back then than now, being a widow was tragic, and it meant death. You see, because for the woman, it wasn't just the death of a spouse, the death of her husband, but for her, being a widow also meant social death and economic death as well. You see, back then, it was a very patriarchal society and culture. You may argue that today is a pretty patriarchal society and culture, but back in the first century, it was even more so. Men had all the rights, and nobody else did. And you had to be the right type of man, too. You had to be a Roman citizen back then. If you were not a Roman, and if you occupied any other place, any other status in society, you were nothing. And that's what it meant to be a woman back then. Back in the first century in Roman society, if you were a woman, you were seen as the property of your husband. You were not even your own person. You were someone's property. You could be killed or divorced on any whim of your man. Women had very little to no legal rights. Their testimony was inadmissible in court. They could not start a court case. Legally, women had the same status as slaves, minors, and criminals. That's just how it was back then. The only worth that they had was associated with their husband or their father if they were not married yet. Women had no identity apart from the men in their lives. They had no identity apart from the children they bore, especially their sons. They only had citizenship through their husbands. And so there was nothing worse than having no husband. And there was nothing worse than being unable to bear children, especially sons. Because back then, the survival of society was really based on how many sons you can produce for your family. Because the more sons you had meant the more citizens you had. The more sons you had meant the more soldiers you had. The more sons you had, the more farmers you had. Because anybody other than sons or men were counted as nothing. Women were seen as too weak to do farming. Women were seen as not as smart as men, so they couldn't participate in the political life. So as you can see, it was very much the identity of a woman to be married and to have children. And so for first century women, if your husband died, it was nothing short of a tragedy. You even see it in the Bible. In the book of Ruth, you notice that when Naomi, when she lost all three, her husband and her two sons, she was done for. She went into depression. She started saying, don't call me Naomi, which means, I think, beautiful in Hebrew, but instead call me Mara, which means bitter. Women would slide down into great despair, even bitterness and resentment if they lost their husbands. It was because of the cultural values back then. It's because of the social values back then. Your definition as a woman was based on your husband. I mean, the analogy here today, I guess I don't mean to sound callous or anything, but no woman back then suffered from anorexia or from bulimia. And you know why? It's because that wasn't their social values back then. Outward beauty, how thin you were, that wasn't the value back then as it is now. Today, the values have changed. We define women by their outer looks. Doesn't mean it's any less wrong. I would even say it's more wrong. And so now women suffer, and even men suffer through anorexia and bulimia and all these other kind of eating disorders. But that wasn't the case back then because women weren't defined by what they ate or how they looked. What they were defined by was who they were married to and how many children they had. And so when they became a widow, the resentment and despair, the depression that they would suffer would be the same as a modern woman who felt that she was not pretty. That's how bad it was back then. They suffered a social death, and they suffered an economic death. They had no property rights. They could own nothing. And once again, they were considered property themselves. There were some exceptions. There was, a rich woman every now and then, but mostly all her riches were in the name of her son or her husband, who maybe not have been able to function in society. You see, all of this was common, not just in Rome, but all of the ancient world, from the Near East all the way to China. This is how women were treated. If there was anybody that could be defined as the least of these, it would be the woman. And because they were the least of these, guess who was greatly concerned for them? God himself. He knew how the world worked. And you know what? God did not stay silent when it came to the widow. He acted. He went against a patriarchal, hierarchical, polygamous society. And he said this in the Old Testament. God was so for the widow, because check this out. No other law code had so much to say about widows than the code, the Ten Commandments, the law that God gave to the Israelites. For instance, in Exodus 22:21-22 and Deuteronomy 27:19, he forbade the exploitation of women. He said, you better not treat them wrong. Then in Deuteronomy 24:19-21, he allowed women to glean from the harvest. Once again, they had no economic means for themselves. They had no way to provide them for themselves if they didn't have a husband. And so what God said is that when you harvest, and when you cut down and when you pick your fruit from your trees and when you cut your wheat and everything, it's bound to happen that you're going to drop some. All right? But unlike other societies in your world, do not go back for the leftovers. Leave them on the ground. And especially if you had a lot of land and you harvest a lot, there's going to be a lot left over. You leave them for the widows. And we saw this in Ruth, in the book of Ruth. When Naomi tells Ruth to say, hey, go to the fields of Boaz and you can glean there because he's a good guy and he follows the law of God. Okay? So God was looking out for the widow. Then in Deuteronomy 14:29, 26:12-13, he gives widow a portion of the tithes. God said, the offering that you give to my temple, some of it is supposed to go to the Levites and priests, but the others are to go to the poor and to the widow. So God gives all of his income to the widows. Then Deuteronomy 16, 9 through 15, he gives widows a provision during festivals. He says in that passage, when you guys are partying it up, you make sure you leave some for the widow. And then Deuteronomy 24, 17, he says, a widow's cloak cannot be taken as collateral for a loan. So if a widow borrows from you, you cannot take as a guarantee the clothes off her back. You leave what she has, essentially what God says to the people of Israel. Then, he says in Deuteronomy 25, 5 to 10, he mandated levirate marriage. Now, what is that? We don't have that anymore. But imagine this. This meant that a man must marry his brother's widow to give her children as well as integrate her back into society. Can you imagine that if that was happening today? Yeah, that's what they did. And so if a person died and he had a wife, then that wife went to his younger brother. All right? And that might feel like, oh my gosh, that's kind of oppressive. No, it wasn't. Once again, this was a society that put value on women based on marriage and based on children. And so the most merciful thing you can do is find a husband for that woman. And so that's what God did. He just made it in his law. You go like, if you have a widow in your family, the next man up, you go marry her. And so back then, they didn't marry out of love. You have to understand that about ancient society. They didn't marry out of love and out of personal happiness. They married for the survival of their family members. Once again, this is all in the context of family, all right? And then, ultimately, in Psalm 72 and Jeremiah 22, God says that he will ultimately judge a king based on how he treated widow and other poor people and other marginalized people in society. You know, when you do a study of the Old Testament, it is easy to think that the reason why God judged the kings and judged the people of Israel was because of their idolatry and because they cheated on God. And yes, that was the main thing. But you also have to understand that their idolatry and their cheating on God with other gods also included that they were unjust to the poor and especially to the widow. If you read some of the worst kings, the stories of the worst kings of Israel, you'll find out that coupled with the fact that they worshipped idols was the fact that they also killed their people, and they also were unjust to widows and other poor people. And so, church, I know this was a little bit of a study here, but I just wanted to prove to you guys that this is how much God cares for the least, as symbolized by the widow. And so if you think God was that serious about the widow in Israelite society, guess how much he cares now. We have a God who is unchanging. He does not change. So you bet that when he looks at us, as it was said in Matthew 25, he's also looking at his sons and daughters and saying, how are you treating the widow among you? How are you treating the widow in society? How are you treating the least of these? Do you even care? Are you willing to go where they go? Are you willing to do whatever is necessary to make sure they're cared for? Because you look at all these right here. All of these laws that God gave Israel in regards to the widow, they all carry some sort of sacrifice. You got to give up some of your money. You got to give up your guarantee that you'll get paid back. You got to give up the clothes off your back. You got to give up your food. There was always sacrifice when it came to serve the needy, to serve the least. And that's what God is all about. The way we bring about a new world is by serving sacrificially, by serving at a cost to ourselves. Deny yourself and take up your cross. So the question for all of us today is, who are our widows? They may be literally widows, true. You know, it's never easy to be a widow or a widower. It's always hard when you lose someone in the family. And those are people in need. So let's go to them. But who also are our widows in our day and age? Read the news. They're very easy to identify. And what God is calling you today is you go and serve them wherever you are. at the cost of yourself. He holds no punches. All right? So, but at the same time, what we learn from Paul is that when we go out to serve the least, we have to serve wisely too. All right? Okay. Paul gives really practical advice to Timothy in this passage. You have to understand that Ephesus was, the Ephesian church was a mega church in a mega city back in the day. And so Timothy needed a lot of wisdom if he was going to pastor this church. It was multicultural, multiple people, so therefore there were multiple needs. And the fact that it had a list of widows already shows that this was a big church that had been around in time and they had things organized. And so what we learn from Paul in his instructions to Timothy on how to serve the least is meet real needs and then give real help. All right? So the first thing he says when it comes to these widows, he says, recognize the widows who actually have needs. Meet real needs. You know, for instance, and so already that had been taking place. The Ephesian church had created a list of widows, okay? And then he also says, you know what? Also understand that not all widows have to be on this list, because some of these widows can be taken care of by their families. And that's one thing that we have to recognize here, is that when God calls us to serve the least, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to serve everybody that comes before us. In fact, we have to be wise and we have to determine who is really in need, who absolutely has no safety net whatsoever, and who are the people that do have some kind of support, and you go and strengthen and encourage that support to take care of them. But I want to say this to you. Just because the church is your family, it doesn't mean you can ignore your blood family, all right? And that's something that sometimes we see at church. That once I became a Christian, you go like, oh, hey, this is my family now. And then you don't care whatsoever for your blood family whatsoever. And honest, the goodness truth, this is a big temptation for pastors. You know, pastors, even if, you know, like you could even read the biography of Billy Graham, and you can see that there are a lot of pastors out there, including myself sometimes, where I go like, the church, this is my family, this, you have all my attention, and then I forget about my wife and my children. When Paul says, hey, widows who have women and family members, grandsons, grandchildren, sons and daughters, if you have widows among you, you go and take care of them. Especially if they're also part of the church as well. You know, but I want to be very clear here, and this is a little bit of a side note. This is not proof texting for the big Christian priority list. Do you guys understand what I'm saying here? Often you hear some Christians, sometimes famous Christians, and when they're asked, what do you value the most in life? Well, I'm a Christian, and so for me it's God first, family second, the church and my football team or something like that, right? Or my work right there. And it's so structured like that, and that sounds really good. But honestly, a lot of dysfunction has happened in the church because people do those priority lists. In one way or another, they end up prioritizing something that they ought not to be prioritizing. And sometimes prioritizing things they don't prioritize things that God wants them to prioritize. This is what I will say to you. When it comes to who should be our priorities, should it be other people, should it be our own family? You make sure that God is not just an item on your priority list, but instead you make God the one who informs and tells you what your priority list ought to be. And as a pastor, this is something I have learned. In some seasons, it's church first, family second. In other seasons, it's family first, church second. And all the while, I'm asking God, being in His presence, asking for wisdom and discernment, what ought to be my priority. It's following Jesus. And sometimes following Jesus comes at a cost. Sometimes It's sometimes it's your relationship with people here, and sometimes it's relationship with other people there. All the while, it's also calling you to the place where you can trust God enough that He will take care of all your relationships, regardless of what season it is. You give God your priority list, and you say, you make my priority list, and you inform my priorities. Now, that's not an excuse to ignore your families or to ignore your church, but rather what it is that you're surrendering everything to God. My professor actually gave me a really good explanation of what it is. He says, don't make a priority list. Rather, view it this way. God is the sun, and He shines His light on everything in your life. And whatever He shines His light on, that's where you go. All right? Now, from the Word of God, what we see here is something pretty clear. You take care of your family as well as you take care of your church. In fact, if you think about this, Paul's instruction to Timothy actually benefits everybody here. Here, widows are taking care of their families, but also the church is being taken care of because you're relieving a burden from the church so they can take care of other widows who are actually really in need and who have no support whatsoever. Okay? What he does tell them is to help women, help widows who show maturity, meaning they depend on God and they're showing it, but also to make sure that they're over 60, because for women over 60, there was no practical hope of what a woman needed to do back in ancient society to get back on her feet. All right? So help people with real needs. But then at the same time, when you help, give real help. For instance, like the Ephesian church, be organized, all right? But you also have to understand when it comes to giving real help, it also means withholding help sometimes. Withholding help. And I put that help in quotation marks. You notice that in the passage he says, withhold from the list those who are taking advantage of the list. Namely, widows who are just living for pleasure, whose God is not really God. You know, that's the thing. We want to help. But sometimes in our helping, we're just enabling bad behavior and bad habits. And God does not call us to be enablers. You know, for instance, I won't reveal his identity, but I had a friend who had no job, okay? You know, he actually graduated from college and he didn't have a job. When he got home, his parents saw his plight, that he had no way of providing for himself, and said, why don't you move back home and we'll provide everything for you as long as you look for a job. And so they provided everything for him, his room, board, clothes, everything. His mother still did his laundry. They cooked for him and everything. You know, in a lot of ways, it was just like the movie Step Brothers. The guy was getting upward towards his 30s. He was getting old, and he still lived with his parents, and he still lived like a kid. He played video games all day. He went out with friends, and he never looked for a job because he didn't need a job, because his parents were always giving to him, always providing everything. And so he made no progress in life. Then finally, his dad got wise and gave him an ultimatum and said, you find a job or you're not living here anymore. And once that happened, once Dad threatened to pull away his provision, guess what my friend did? He went and found a job. Almost exactly like the movie Step Brothers, but it's not the movie Step Brothers. It was actually someone I knew. See, sometimes the best way to help a person is to withhold help, because we want to be helpers, not enablers. We do not want to enable bad behavior and bad habits. And also another group that Paul said, hey, don't put them on the list, were widows who can remarry. Now you may be going, wait, what's going on here? Is Paul being condescending and misogynistic? I mean, marry a man, isn't that conforming to the patriarchal society that they were in? No, Paul was not being that. He was putting them on a list because he knew that putting them on the list would hurt them in the reality they lived in. You know, you've all heard it said, give a fish to a person, feed them for a day. Teach a person to fish, you feed them for a lifetime. To put them on the list would have been giving a fish for them every day for the rest of their lives. And they wouldn't learn how to take care of themselves. you know? But instead, what Paul was telling Timothy to do was, you teach them how to fish. So for a woman back then meant, yes, get remarried and then start running your household, start teaching your children, start preparing them, start becoming a productive member of society again, essentially what he's saying. And so for us, what would that be? That would be how can the church help people? It's not to give them food and bread all the time, but rather to teach them to work. And I think that's what these ESL classes and what these citizenship classes are all about. And this is why in VBS, we're not just teaching the Bible, but we're also teaching kids some life skills too as well. See, that's all part of gospel ministry right there, you know? It also prevented them from exposing themselves to sin. You know, idleness and gossip. Well, those are common sins for everybody when you don't have anything to do. I know when I have nothing to do, I end up doing stuff that I ought not to be doing, like talking about people, all right? But more importantly, this was the thing that Paul was going against. He was saying this also prevents them from idolizing marriage. You notice that in the verse he says, do not put young widows on such a list, for when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Paul's not saying that marriage is an awful thing. What he was warning Timothy about was that when widows, knowing that getting married is the way that they live in society, can idolize marriage, just like how a lot of people idolize their careers, because they know their careers can give them a place in society. And so what Paul told Timothy to do is say, just allow them to get married right away. Because then you would prevent their marriage to become an idol where there shouldn't be an idol, all right? So it's very practical here. So for instance, it's like, just help someone find a job, so that they don't start idolizing money and idolizing the things that they can't seem to get, all right? So how do we serve wisely? How can we apply this to our church today? How can we meet real needs and give real help? Well, you know what? Guess what? Our church has run into this. Let me tell you this. We give a lot of money to Cambodia. And one time, there was a time where 3 leaders in the Cambodian church got hurt. They either got in a car accident or they got bit by a snake. It was really weird because it all happened all at once. And so out of our generosity, we as a church decided, hey, let's send them a lot of money to pay all their medical costs and to even pay for a funeral where it applied. We thought we were doing a good thing. But then our missionaries came back to us and said, this is super generous, but if you give that much money to this society, in this neighborhood, what you will do, you'll be singling them out. They would be able to pay for things and have things that none of their neighbors would be able to afford themselves. And thus, instead of really helping them, you will make them into a target of bitterness and resentment. And so let's talk and let's find a better way to help our brothers and sisters in Cambodia. And you know what that taught us, especially as a church leadership, is that, hey man, not all the time, what we think might be help actually might not be help at all. So how do we provide real help as a church? Well, I love this couple, Sue and Sina Lau, because they give a really good example of what it means to give real help. You know what? They give to those in real need. One of the things that Sue and Sina do is that sometimes they pay for dental work for some of the people in their church. Because of the poor, environment, a lot of people aren't able to practice real good dental hygiene or have proper dental care. And so a lot of people have very, very bad teeth. Now, if you're looking for a job in the city, when you go to an interview and you smile and all you have is cavities and dark stuff and crooked teeth, in a very superficial society that we all live in, that actually is a mark against you. And a lot of people weren't able to get jobs because they had bad teeth. And so what Sun and Sina did was that they would find people who couldn't afford those things, and they would actually send them to Thailand and get proper dental work. And guess what? Then they were able to smile and have a good, confident smile and do better in their interviews. And so that's an example of Sun and Sina just giving real help right then and there. But the majority of the time, they just don't do handouts like that. It's actually a very rare occasion in which they do that. What they do as part of their ministry, as well as teaching the gospel, as well as sharing Jesus, is that they are teaching people how to work. This here is a picture of I don't know what you call it, a mushroom greenhouse in their backyard. And in those little bags are mushrooms that are growing. And what they are doing is that they're teaching the people in their church and essentially anybody who would come to them how to grow these mushrooms by the bushels in their backyards, in their own backyards, so they could sell on the street. And not only that, this is just one example. Sina, who's a baker, also knows that American baked goods are super popular in Cambodia. And so guess what she's doing? She's teaching people how to bake American cupcakes, banana bread, and they're selling like hotcakes there. And thus, she's teaching them how to work. And so this is something that we can do as well. What does this look like in San Francisco? I know for one thing, as a church, next time we go to Cambodia, I invite you guys to donate as many bakeware as possible because they need them, and we'll take them in a big brown bag to Cambodia. That's a way you can help. But how can we help San Francisco, our own neighborhood? That means we got to do our homework. What are the real needs out there? And how can we provide real help? The church is not called to give out handouts. The church is called to come alongside people and actively engage in their lives, to come alongside them, to get through any kind of difficulties they may go through. That's what it means to serve the least of these. It means identifying with the least of these, to live life the way they live it. So who are the least of these in our context? They could be widows, they could be the homeless, they could be members of our own family, they could be people who are hurting right now, they could be immigrants who are just new here in San Francisco, what have you. Who are the least? All right? And when in doubt, if you can't figure out how to serve them wisely, just go back to the gospel. Ask for Jesus to teach you. Jesus makes us family, so don't go by it alone. The best way to help is to go as a family. If you have a burden on your heart, you invite a brother or sister to go with you. And then also this, Jesus teaches. You notice that when Jesus came and Jesus taught, and he taught the people how to live and how to live for God. You know, he says, "Come to me, all you are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Learn from me and know the rhythms of grace." So what that means is that we got to actively engage. Serving the least is not just one and done. Here's my $50. Okay, I'm good. No, it's actually going to the least. And you know what? We have great opportunities every Sunday to go to the Tenderloin to serve the least. You name it. New immigrants, the poor, drug addicts, what have you. To go to be with them, to provide our presence there. So every 1:15 in the afternoon on Sundays, go see Pastor Chan and go to the Tenderloin and come alongside the least in our city. All right? And then also, Jesus died. He paid for what we cannot pay for, and he did it for strangers and enemies as well as for friends and family. And that's what we got to remember. All right? When it comes down to it, to be a disciple of Christ is to love. And love means serving people sacrificially. Because this is what 1 John 3:16 says. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. So may I invite you guys back into God's presence right now. Let's bow our heads, close our eyes. And would you say this verse with me? This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Let's read it one more time together so that it goes into not just our heads, but into our hearts. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. One more time. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. Would you make this your prayer today?